Good evening and welcome to Flashpoint. My name is Mark Green. Kevin MacDonald is professor of psychology at Cal State University in Long Beach. His book, The Culture of Critique, is the third and most recent volume in a series on Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy. In his book, Professor MacDonald describes how Jewish intellectuals have initiated and advanced important political and intellectual movements throughout the 20th century and beyond. More significantly, however, Professor MacDonald claims that many of these same movements and the very science under which they were launched were covertly designed to advance specifically Jewish interests, often at the expense of larger non-Jewish populations. Professor MacDonald?
Glad to be here.
Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Well, first, a scientific question. What is meant by group evolutionary strategy?
Well, a group evolutionary strategy is basically a way for a group to get out in the world. And so when you study a group evolutionary strategy, you basically try to see how the group organizes itself, how it prevents group members from cheating, doing things that interfere with group interests. Mm-hmm. And how, for example, it prevents intermarriage, so that it keeps the gene pool pure, as it were. Mm-hmm. So those are the main things. For example, speaking about Judaism, over the centuries, it was quite common for Jewish groups to regulate the business practices within the group and between Jews and non-Jews. Mm-hmm. So that would be a very important area for maintaining their economic niche.
Mm-hmm. And there was a concept of evolutionary strategy. That's part of evolutionary psychology, which is the larger scientific focus. But it's a widely accepted concept within the...
I think evolutionary psychology is getting more and more acceptable within mainstream psychology now. Mm-hmm. And it intersects with my work. It's not the whole thing, certainly, but one of the things I'm interested in is what psychological mechanisms are involved in ethnocentrism and group identity and group conflict. I mean, I wrote my second book was about anti-Semitism, so you want to know what psychological mechanisms are being triggered that result in between-group conflict. And those are, my view is that these mechanisms are evolved mechanisms. We are not blank slates. And as we come into these conflict situations with some very strong predispositions, and that's why we see ethnic conflict around the world today as we have throughout the past.
So it's your opinion and others that we're hardwired, as it were, to have certain proclivities?
Well, yeah, proclivities. I don't like to use the word hardwired because there are certain environmental influences and there are a lot of context effects and so on. But yes, we tend to have negative attitudes towards outgroups. We tend to have more rapport and a sense of common identity and comfort level, I think, with people of our own kind. Mm-hmm. And that's
universal, you think?
Yes, I do believe it, yeah. But I think some peoples are more ethnocentric than others.
And is that what you call genetic similarity theory? Is that your theory? Or is that why?
That's Phil Rushton's theory, and he's an evolutionary psychologist. And his idea is that we are attracted to people who are like ourselves, who have similar psychological traits, but also physical features and other attributes that make us similar, and we have more rapport with them, we're more altruistic towards them, and so on. And I think that's a big part of it. I think that people, especially when you have a group like the Jews, they've been together for so long, and they have a common, biological, their gene pool has been sort of segregated from the surrounding society. They have a very strong psychological rapport with each other. Mm-hmm. And you see that over, you're talking about these Jewish intellectual movements. So one of the basic features about those movements is simply the psychological rapport of the people at the center of those movements. In other words, the sense of comradeship, camaraderie, the sense of, I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back, sort of mutual promotion and that sort of thing.
Well, I want to quote you, this is from The Culture of Critique. You say, quote, Jewish intellectuals have developed intellectual movements that have subjected the institutions of Gentile society, that's non-Jews of course, to, quote, radical forms of criticism. Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think that one of the common denominators, at least of the movements that I discussed in The Culture of Critique, has been a sort of view that the surrounding culture, that the non-Jewish society was in need of radical change, that it was fundamentally evil, as it were. I think it derives from the fact that the Jews feel that they've been victimized over the centuries, and it's like a huge chip on their shoulder, as it were. In other words, when someone who strongly identifies as a Jew, when they look back at history, they think of it as a series of persecutions. You know, when they think of the Middle Ages, they don't think of cathedrals and saints and pilgrimages. They think of, you know, crusaders killing Jews. They think of persecutions. They think of the Inquisition. You know, when they think of the Tsar, they don't think of, you know, palaces or whatever the good things that the Tsar did. They think of the anti-Jewish laws of the late 19th century, that sort of thing. And so there's always this sense that they've been victims for the last 2,000 years in Christian society. And so, you know, when they came to America, there was some anti-Jewish attitudes, and I think those attitudes were, you know, fairly subtle by historical standards. We didn't have any pogroms, we didn't killing Jews, but at the same time, if Jews wanted to join a country club, they wanted to go to a hotel, maybe there was sort of, you know, sort of subtle anti-Jewish attitudes, especially among sort of, well, I think it was pretty common until after World War II, actually. But well, that sort of thing was then, as soon as that happens, it's sort of put in the psychological bin of this is the long part of the long history of Western culture that culminated in the Holocaust.
Well, they would naturally say, "Can you blame them?" What do you say?
Well, I think that's a reason. It's not unreasonable. I think that's it's understandable, and that's what I'm trying to say. That when you want to understand this, you have to understand the psychological mechanisms involved. And from their point of view, you know, they see Western culture as an out-group culture. It is the culture of the other, you know, and it's they have a very positive attitude in general towards Judaism. And one of the things I tried to do in the culture critique, in every chapter where I claimed that there was a Jewish intellectual movement, I think the first thing I had to establish was that the people at the center of it were strongly identified Jews.
Well, I want to ask you,
they took Jews very seriously.
Well, I want to ask you now about those numerous significant movements, to say the very least. But what do all these intellectual movements have in common besides Jewish leaders and a Jewish core of disciples? Is that basically it right there?
That is certainly an important. That's, I think, the main thing. That you have the people at the center of the movement are strong identified Jews who have a sense of pursuing specific Jewish group interests. You know, for example, psychoanalysis, deeply concerned with anti-Semitism, wanting to eradicate anti-Semitism. Look at the Frankfurt School. And psychoanalysis, attempting to erect these psychological theories that any kind of prejudice against an outgroup, like Jews, was a pathology, a psychiatric disorder.
But you're leaving one other thing out too, and that is the role of deception.
Well, certainly there was some of that. In general, these movements that were not advertised as Jewish movements. I mean, they were advertised in sort of universal terms. If you think of leftist political ideology, or even psychoanalysis, there's nothing in psychoanalytic theory that talks about Jews. I mean, so it's all you're talking about neuroses and this and that. But when it came to understanding, you know, ethnic hostility, it was viewed as a pathology. But there was no attempt to really understand Jewish ethnocentrism either. You know, in other words, psychoanalysis never came up with a theory of Jewish ethnocentrism. The Jews were sort of outside the process. The attempt was to sort of put Western culture and people who had negative attitudes towards Jews, put them on the couch, make them sort of the problem.
So it was sort of like Marxism, which we'll get to in a moment. The Jews were given sort of a privileged status, and whereas Christians were persecuted under the communists, this is following the Russian Revolution, if I understand you correctly, they accorded room for people to maintain a Jewish identity in post-revolutionary Russia, for instance, and elsewhere?
Actually, Marxism is very interesting from a standpoint of a Jewish intellectual movement, because there's no part of Marxism that talks about Jews. I mean, it's universal. It's about class struggle. And yet, in the post-Soviet Union, it was, you know, they came to grips with these various national groups, including Jews. So Jews were allowed to keep their identity in the post-Soviet world, and of course, many did. I mean, when 40, 50 years later, when you started to have people wanting to emigrate to Israel and so on, these people still had very strong Jewish identity. They didn't, you know, Judaism didn't stop in the Soviet Union, far from it. But it always had this veneer of universalism. And so